Okay, guys, we are going to finish up chapter 9. So we've talked about a lot of 9. Section 2, we talked about geologic time, and the one thing we didn't touch on yet is absolute dating. Thought it was just a little bit too much to do that all in one lecture for us. So we're going to do 9.2. We're still in 9.2, but we're now focusing on this part of 9.2, and that's all about absolute dating. Up until this point, we've talked about relative dating. So relative dating in terms of, remember, asking ourselves younger versus older. That's it. That's all relative dating does. What's younger and what's older. Absolute dating, just look even at that word, what that means, absolute. If something is absolute, it is certain. So in absolute dating, now we are actually looking at the exact age of something. So absolute dating is the method of measuring the exact age of an object, such as a rock or fossil, in years. So whereas you look at relative dating and say, like, okay, maybe you're younger than your older brother, but now saying, okay, my brother is 17 and I am 14. So now looking at that and giving an exact age to it. So when we absolutely date rocks, we are looking at assigning an actual age to it. Scientists use both of these things to help develop the geologic time scale that we've talked about in this section. So it's not just absolute dating, it's not just relative dating. They use both of these as clues to put together to develop that geologic time scale that we know of. So what do they do? How do they do this? Now, I'm going to try to give you the simplified version, but it is pretty complicated when you think about it, but we're going to try to keep it simple. So rocks change over time. Some rocks do. What scientists then do is they measure for some of these rocks how they change, how much they change. The more they change, the older they are. The less they change, the younger they are. What we use specifically is something called radioactive decay, how unstable atoms lose energy and matter over time. So some elements in rocks are what we call radioactive. What that means then is over time, these radioactive elements go from being unstable to stable. That's one way that we say it. So they go from being unstable to stable over time. So if we can measure inside these rocks how much stable stuff is left and how much unstable stuff is left, we can use that to try to identify the age of those rocks. So as a result of this radioactive decay going from unstable to stable, elements turn into actually whole other elements over a period of time. Carbon-14, real important element that we talk about in geology. Carbon-14 is used frequently in geology to date things, especially things that were alive, because they contain carbon. Carbon-14 over time will turn into nitrogen. So it completely turns into another element. So if I'm a scientist, I can try to look at, all right, how much of this carbon-14 is there? How much of this stable nitrogen atoms are there? And I can use that to try to figure out how old that rock is. The amount of time it takes it to turn from that stable to unstable element is called a half-life. So half-life is the amount of time it takes for 1/2 of a radioactive sample to decay. It's like a clock. It's just like a clock, clockwork. Depending upon the element, it's going to depend upon what is the half-life for that element. This slide uses the picture of uranium. Scientists know that it takes 4.5 billion years for 1/2 of uranium atoms in a specimen to turn into lead. So uranium is an unstable radioactive element, and over time it turns into stable lead. So what scientists can do, once again, I'm studying how much uranium is there, how much lead is there, and I'm going to use that. But here's this new concept, half-life. How long does this take? This one is really long. If you paid attention to the last slide, that carbon-14, it's around 5,700 years. Sounds like a lot to us, but look at this one, 4.5 billion years. So a much, much longer period of time. So here's those two we were just talking about. So uranium turning into lead, carbon-14 turning into nitrogen. So you're both going from radioactive to stable or unstable to stable. And every time it's going to go through what we call a half-life. And you'll notice if I look at the percentages, you can start to see now why we call it a half-life. 100% uranium atoms, as it goes through a half-life, you're going to have 50% uranium, 50% lead. Carbon-14, after it undergoes that one half-life of 5,730 years, I'm going to go from 100% carbon-14 to 50% carbon-14. Another term that we use sometimes too, you'll see parent to daughter, or radioactive to stable, or undecayed to decayed. So those are just some other terms that we think of sometimes. So if I'm looking at a graph, you'll notice here, look at the number of half-lives on the bottom. Every time it goes through a half-life, look at what's left of the parent material, which would also be our unstable material. At one half-life, there's 50%. At two half-lives, there's 25%. At three half-lives, there would be 13%. It's almost like imagine you have a pizza, and every time you go through a half-life, you got to split it in half and keep splitting your pizza in half until hypothetically there is nothing else left. So what scientists then do is they're figuring out then how much of this parent and daughter material do I have. So I can use that. If I see, all right, I'm studying in this rock, it's 50%, I can look at it and go, okay, it must have went through one half-life if it has 50%. Here's just another thing. I like the pizza analogy. I'm an old lady, but I still like the pizza analogy because it makes sense to my brain. I'm picturing a picture here. So I got that whole pizza, goes through one half-life, boom, I got half of it left. Another half-life, goes through a quarter there. So every single time it goes through a half-life, it's getting chopped in half. That's why it's called a half-life. So we use carbon-14 a lot because it's used to date fossils found in all living organisms. So as we just saw earlier, carbon-14 decays into nitrogen, actually nitrogen-14. So I can sit and figure out how much is left. So if I see I have a quarter, if you look on this graph here, if I have a quarter carbon-14 that's left, I can see, okay, it went through two half-lives. And if I know the half-life of carbon-14 is 5,730 years, and it went through two half-lives, I can start to see, okay, now how old it is. So you can start to get a little bit better of an idea piecing together age of things. So trees and absolute dating. This is kind of a weird side subject in here. This is a little bit newer of a concept that we use, but it definitely works. So not only do we use radioactive decay to date rocks, we can also look at trees on Earth here. So trees, every year they grow a tree ring. They have one ring, just like you see in the picture there. Now, when you think about this, so you can not only, so if I cut a tree in half, not only can I tell how old it is, but think about what other things can I tell. You'll notice just from even looking at this, I can see some rings are thicker. I can see on the left side of the tree there, okay, it looks like there's kind of a bump in there. Maybe there was an injury over there. So now you can start to see how I can use a tree ring to piece together what things look like. Andrew Douglas was an astronomer who actually first made this discovery to say, hey, something's going on here. And what he hypothesized is the things that I was just talking about here. So not only can we use it to figure out how old a tree is, we can use it to essentially estimate what climate was like or what precipitation was like that year, because the trees are plants. They've got great growing conditions. They're going to grow great. You're going to have nice big growth rings. If bad things happen like fires and droughts, you're not going to have really big growth rings. You're going to often see, so 1 year's growth is you're going to have a light and a dark, and really what they're called is a summer wood and winter wood, but just keep that in mind when you guys are doing this. I believe this is pine trees that this comes up in when you're looking at those. So trees are actually like history books. Each tree ring is a record of what the environment was like that year. So wider tree rings is telling us, hey, wet year, good things happening for the tree. Narrow rings, could not have been a great year, must have been a dry year. Douglas actually named this new field of science dendrochronology. There are actually people who this is what they do, and if that's the case, you are a dendrochronologist, and then you literally go through and study tree rings, which is pretty cool. The oldest tree on record is what is known as a bristlecone pine tree. This is a picture of what one of those looks like, and you look at that and go, what? That doesn't look that exciting. But when you think about how long these trees have been here on Earth, it is really crazy. So this, not this tree in particular, but the oldest one on record actually has a name. It's called Methuselah. It is 4,765 years old. When you even to just start think about a tree being that old and think about what was life like 4,765 years ago, we're talking about like completely different world, completely different world. These trees grow in California. There's great conditions for them. I'm pretty sure you can't go find Methuselah for obvious reasons, so someone does not go and chop it down. But that species of trees grows there. It's just great growing conditions there for those trees. So just looking at dating things now again. So just keep in mind when we talk about relative dating, that's just older over younger. So if I looked at this pile of leaves, if I looked at this pile of rocks here, or these rocks, I could sit and use relative dating techniques to piece together which is older, which is younger. Whereas absolute dating is now, okay, I'm going to take a look at radioactive isotopes, amount of elements left, radioactive, not radioactive, and I'm going to use that to date rock layers or rocks or fossils.